Hello, this is Mr. Brooks, and welcome to Lesson 2-4, Reasoning and Algebra. In this lesson, we will connect reasoning in algebra and geometry, and we will try to justify steps in a logical argument. First, we will begin with the properties of equality. Our first property is the addition property. The addition property of equality simply states that if you add the same thing to both sides of an equation, you get equivalent equations, such as if we add 5 to both sides of this equation, we will get 3x equals 19. Right here, we have used the addition property of equality. Next, the subtraction property of equality states very similarly, if you subtract the same thing from both sides of an equation, you get equivalent equations. Here we subtract 6 from both sides, and we get 2x equals 7. Right here, we have used the subtraction property of equality. Next, the multiplication property of equality says if you multiply both sides of an equation by the same thing, you get equivalent equations. So if we were to multiply both sides of this equation by 3, we will have equivalent equations. Our 3's cancel and we're left with x equals 48. Here we have used the multiplication property of equality. The division property of equality states if you divide both sides of an equation by the same thing, you get equivalent equations. Now I'll use the division property of equality. I'm going to divide both sides by 5, and I have used the division property of equality to get x equals 17. Our next three properties of equality are the reflexive property, symmetric property, and transitive property. The reflexive property states that anything equals itself. Symmetric property says if A equals B, then B equals A. I like to say if this equals that, then that equals this. And transitive property, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. I say it like this: if the first thing equals the second, and the second thing equals the third, then the first thing has to equal the third. Our last property of equality is the substitution property. And I think our students are pretty familiar with substitution, so I'm not going to spend time on that. Our next property is the distributive property, and that simply is using distribution where we multiply the 3 times the x and the 3 times the 4. Right here we have used the distributive property. Now let's see if we can justify the steps in solving an equation. If we're asked to solve for x, the first thing we would do, hopefully, is add the two small angles together to get the big angle. And hopefully you would agree this would be angle addition postulate. Second step, hopefully you see that would be substitution. And when you abbreviate that, I want you to go out at least that far so it doesn't get confused with the subtraction property of equality. Next, hopefully you would agree, this would be combining like terms. Combining like terms, and then we're going to subtract 10 from both sides, so that's the subtraction property of equality. And last, we divide both sides by 3, which would be division property of equality. Now I'd like you to take a minute and see if you can fill in the missing steps on quick check number 1. Please pause the video while you try to fill these in. This is what I said. Okay, first we start with the given that ray LM bisects angle KLN, which means it cuts it into 2 equal halves. So the next step we can say the measure of angle MLN equals the measure of angle KLM, and this step is given to you. The reason is definition of angle bisector, and that is a very important step, and you need to remember that for problems in the future. that if you're given ray bisects an angle, know that it cuts it into 2 equal halves by definition of angle bisector. Now hopefully you came up with the next step to be substitution. Substitution property. And then hopefully you agree you subtract 2x from both sides. So that would be subtraction property. Remember to take that out so I know it's not the same as substitution. And last, you divide both sides by 2, which would be the division property. Now let's look at example 2. First it says, excuse me. First it says we need to solve for y and justify each step, and it tells us that the length of the entire segment is 21. So hopefully you know that the segment addition postulate tells you the 2 small segments add up to the big segment. So you're going to start with AB plus BC equaling AC. Again, that's by the segment addition postulate. Remember that. Then we substitute 2y in for AB and 3y minus 9 in for BC and 21 in for AC, and then we solve the equation. In the third step, I do not want you to put simplify. Again, I want you to put combine like terms, like you learned it in middle school. Do not put simplify there, put combine like terms. And then we add 9 to both sides, then we divide both sides by 5. Now, quick check number 2 asks us to substitute 6, our answer, back in and see if AC equals 21. Well, like I said, segment addition postulate says the 2 small segments add up to the big segment. So AB plus BC equals AC. AB was 2y, so when we substitute 6 in for y, that's 12. BC was 3y minus 9, so when we substitute 6 in there, we're going to get 9, and hopefully you agree that adds up to 21. So we checked our answer, it is correct. Now the last thing we have on page 105 is again our reflexive, symmetric, and transitive properties of congruence, which are basically the exact same thing as the reflexive, symmetric, and transitive properties of equality. And I really don't make a big deal whether you say of equality or of congruence, as long as you know the reflexive, symmetric, and transitive properties. Again, reflexive property was anything equals itself, or anything is congruent to itself. Symmetric property, if this equals that, then that equals this. Or in this case, now it's congruence. If the first thing's congruent to the second, then the second's congruent to the first. And last, transitive property of equality is if the first thing equals the second and the second equals the third, then the first equals the third. Now that we're doing congruence, you'll say if the first thing is congruent to the second and the second is congruent to the third, then the first is congruent to the third. Now let's look at example 3. First they have angle K is congruent to angle K, which is the reflexive property of congruence. In part B, you're going to add 8 to both sides to go from if 2x minus 8 equals 10 to 2x equals 18. So that's the addition property of equality. In part C, if segment RS is congruent to segment TW, and segment TW is congruent to segment PQ, then segment RS is congruent to segment PQ, is transitive property of congruence. But again, if you just say transitive property, I'm fine with that. And last, if the measure of angle A equals the measure of angle B, then the measure of angle B equals the measure of angle A. If the first thing equals the second and the second equals the first, then we have the symmetric property of equality. Okay, in quick check number 3, they're asking us for the property of equality or the property of congruence illustrated in the 2 examples. I want you to pause the video and see if you can come up with the right answers. Okay, for part A, hopefully you came up with the reflexive property of congruence. But if you just said reflexive property, like I said, I'm fine with that. For part B, hopefully you will agree if the first thing equals the second and the second thing equals the third, then the first equals the third is the transitive property of equality. But I don't care if you say of equality or of congruence, so just transitive property is fine. This concludes lesson 2-4.